This is the barracks building. About 80 soldiers actually lived in here. It's essentially a large open bay. The end of the building was the battery commander's office, first sergeant.
This last door here was the craft shop, which I kept open at night for the boys to have something to do. Smithfield was a regular little walk away, but some of them got up there.
I think this base is so perfect because we haven't even gone through and modernized it. Most of the toilets and most all of the sinks are the same ones that the GIs used here from 1954 past 1961. It's all authentic. After the 1622 massacre in 1623, the settlers, colonists, decided they needed some sort of defense. Typical triangular fort of the early 1600s, early 17th century. For those of you familiar with Virginia history, you know that's basically what the Jamestown fort looked like. There's not a lot of evidence, but we're pretty sure that there was one of these forts built at the Fort Boykin site and also probably up where Fort Huger is. The James River is here, but this fort is built for 360-degree defense. You've got these little bastions where guns could fire down, primarily again for attacking Indians. What the English were worried about, of course, were the Spaniards. And this was an armed Spanish galleon. The Spanish never actually landed. We go into phase 2, and this, of course, is our own Revolutionary War. The enemy, of course, by 1775 was the British, just a typical British man of war, 100 guns, coming up the James. There are several instances of sightings, but in this case, the British actually never landed. All along the James now, the colonists in 1775 primarily built Fort Boykin. This is the same location as that one you saw earlier, the castle. The colonists greatly expanded the fort, 1775, 1776. Here's the James River again. Notice, though, that the orientation of the defense has now shifted primarily to the James. They were worried about British shipping coming up the James, not really so much worried about rear defense anymore, but all of your major gun positions are obviously facing the James. That phase, of course, was successful. We now go into phase 3 of Isle of Wight County's coast defense history, the War of 1812. A lot of, in many history books, this is known as the America's Second War of Independence. This is a depiction of what's called the Chesapeake Leopard Affair, where the USS Chesapeake sailed out. It was waylaid by a British man of war. They took 4 seamen off of it, 4 sailors, and Norfolk especially was up in arms. We really thought we were going to go to war. The very next year, Fort Norfolk was begun and completed. Fort Boykin now modified again to bring it up to Vauban standards. Notice this is a typical star-shaped fort now. They've expanded it greatly. In each phase of warfare, the fort there was upgraded to take advantage of the latest in military technology. Well, okay, this is phase 4. The United States government tricked us. They told us that we didn't need to defend ourselves anymore. They would take care of us. So they built huge forts, like this is Fort Monroe, of course. And so this is where the United States government, of course, took care of its own defense. But what we here in Isle of Wight County feel we were tricked, because what happened when Virginia seceded in 1861, they didn't give us Fort Monroe. They kept it for themselves. And so once again, we were all on our own. Fort Monroe was called Freedom's Fortress because early in the war, Benjamin Butler had the bright idea that since the South claimed that blacks were not people, that they were property, they belonged to somebody, and there was a law in warfare that you could actually take property from somebody else legally, one side from another. Benjamin Butler declared blacks as contraband, and therefore thousands of slaves deserted, left their plantations here on the South Side and other places and went to Fort Monroe, where they ostensibly got their freedom as much as could be had, but at least they weren't technically slaves anymore. This is the last phase now of Isle of Wight County Coast Defense, the world's first real intercontinental bomber. We used them primarily in Japan, developed in 1942. Very, very long range. We didn't need those ranges in Europe because the B-17s could cross the Channel and the B-24s and return after bombing Germany. We're building up to the Cold War. In 1940, early 45, 3 of our B-29 Superfortresses ran out of fuel and landed in Russia. The Russians impounded them. They also kept the crews for a while. And then what the Russians did is they back-engineered our B-29 and produced several hundred of these aircraft that were exact copies of the B-29. Designation is Tu-4. It is an exact copy of the B-29. And so now the Russians have intercontinental bomber capability. In 1948, the Russians decided that they wanted to bring the situation in Berlin to a head. The city of Berlin then was completely surrounded. There were 4 zones in Berlin: French, British, American, and Russian. The French, British, and American zones, of course, were open, but the Russians blockaded the place and refused to let any supply convoys to go in. But we could fly in, and that's what the Berlin blockade was all about. The Berlin airlift, essentially what the Americans and the British and the French did was to supply Berlin for upwards of 9 months with everything it needed to survive as a city. Thousands and thousands of flights, including coal, heating coal. You can see now that the Cold War is starting to heat up. In August of 1949, the Russians exploded their first atomic bomb. We've got an enemy that has already blockaded Berlin. The Russians have 2 things now. They have an intercontinental bomber, and they have nuclear weapons. In 1950, in June, the North Koreans, of course, attacked South Korea in starting the Korean War. And what the history books say is that the Cold War all of a sudden got hot. At the time, we were under the impression that the Russians were completely behind this. We know now, a little bit later, that the Russians actually didn't want the North Koreans to do it. And it was reinforced by things like that. That's a United States Marine in the city of Seoul, and there was a poster of Joseph Stalin. So images like this reinforced in the American mind that we weren't just at war with the North Koreans, that we were at war with the Russians too. All of a sudden, the Russians have a bomber, the Russians have the atomic bomb, and we believe that the Russians now are behind the hot war in Korea. So beginning in 1951, the United States deployed hundreds of World War II era anti-aircraft guns all around the major ports and the major centers of the United States, like around Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, because that's all we had to shoot down Russian bombers. Now, at the same time, what we were doing is, of course, we were developing a missile. The United States took German rocket technology and built and fielded the world's very first successful surface-to-air missile. And it's called Nike Ajax. It's a 2-stage rocket, and it had a high explosive warhead. So here's what we did. The United States and its allies built 300 bases for Nike Ajax missiles, 200 in the United States, roughly, about 100 overseas in Germany and Japan. The range of the Nike Ajax is about 25 miles, 25 to 30 miles. So obviously what they had to do, what we had to do, was to put them close in to areas that we wanted defended. This is the NDA, the Norfolk Defense Area. 8 bases, Nike Ajax missile bases, surrounding basically the port of Hampton Roads. Obviously the military objectives would be Langley Air Base, the Norfolk Naval Base, Oceana Naval Air Station, Newport News Shipyard, the Norfolk Naval Base, which is actually in Portsmouth. So very, very much a concentrated military area as it still is today. And 8 of these missile sites were constructed. This is how they worked. The 3 radars and the computer were out at Jones Creek. The acquisition radar would acquire the target. Again, we're talking about a single airplane now. They would obviously be a fleet of bombers, but they would lock on one single airplane. The information would go into the computer, as to altitude, speed, that sort of thing. That information then would be transferred to the target tracking radar, would lock onto it, then they would launch the missile. The first stage would drop off, and then the second stage would intercept the plane and blow it up.
How many soldiers were here at one time?
The whole unit was about a little bit less than 200, about half here and the other half over at Jones Creek. That's Ralph Wilkerson. That's the guard shack that was out at the front, and that is the only structure that's missing. Otherwise, this site is absolutely complete. And as far as I can determine, it's the most complete existing Nike Ajax site on the East Coast. The building over there, the higher building, is the original missile test and assembly building. The missiles were brought in and had to be actually assembled here by Ralph and other soldiers on site.
When that siren went off at 3 o'clock in the morning, you didn't dress. You didn't dress, you grabbed your socks and ran. Down here, go down in the hole and get the missile up in so many minutes. It was fun, really. I said it was like Boy Scouts, really.
How often did y'all do that?
They didn't tell us. I mean, they did it at least 5-6 times a week.
Oh, really?
That
often?
Oh, they didn't let you. They didn't let you lie around much. You, 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, those sirens go off. You go, and a lot of times, the major would be coming in to inspect us with that siren also. To see how long it took you to get down there and get them up and ready to fire.
Remember, the enemy aircraft would have been detected maybe 100 miles or so out, and those planes would have been flying, several hundred miles an hour. And so they had just barely minutes to get the missiles operational.